Thank you,
speak to the motion.
Chair. I move the motion be read for a second time. I suppose I want to start before I get into the short bill before us, just by asking a couple of questions. And I've asked them, I suppose, in a sincere way. The first one is, how many real social houses do we actually need to meet the level of demand that's out there at the moment? And I use the word real social houses deliberately, partly because that was what the Dáil Housing and Homeless Committee talked about back in 2016 in our report, when we talked about houses owned by local authorities and approved housing bodies. But also because I think it's important when we're talking about meeting the long-term needs of people on social housing waiting lists, notwithstanding the need for subsidised private rental accommodation as a short-term measure, real social houses is what we should be looking at. And the answer to the question in terms of how many real social houses do we need is approximately 130,000. We know there's just over 70,000 households on the local authority housing waiting lists, approximately 40,000 households in receipt of the housing assistance payment, just under 20,000 households in receipt of the rental accommodation scheme. So any government strategy that's going to work in the short to medium term has to have a target of, at a minimum to meet current need, 130,000 units. So what does Rebuilding Ireland commit to over the next number of years, from 2018 to 2021? The number of real social houses owned by local authorities and approved housing bodies is just under 30,000. Post Rebuilding Ireland, if you look at the National Development Plan targets up to 2024, it's approximately 10,000 real social houses a year. So what that means is between now and 2024, government, on the basis of the current targets, is going to meet approximately 45% of the real long-term social housing need of the households currently on the list. And of course that means not only are they going to be short on current need, but they're not going to be able to take into account future need as people come on the list. And of course that's assuming the targets are met. Now, I've always been very clear, the Rebuilding Ireland targets in 2016 and 2017 were met. There is a concern, particularly in the construction targets at the end of the second quarter of this year, they're only at 28%. So whether or not that target, and it's quite a significant target, will be met, we'll have to wait and see. But what is without doubt is the gap between what will be delivered, both under Rebuilding Ireland and the NDP, and the level of need there. That gap is enormous. So then when we look at affordable housing, the situation is actually somewhat worse. And if you ask the question, well, how many affordable homes to buy and rent do we need in our housing system? The straight answer is we don't know. The government doesn't actually and hasn't attempted to calculate what level of need is out there in terms of affordable rental or purchase. A Morocco research published yesterday at the Housing Agencies Conference has tried to get a sense of how many people living in the private rental sector, for example, are paying over 30% for their accommodation, and the number is quite high. And the ESRI, in a paper published earlier this summer, talked about 32% of households paying more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgages. But in the bottom 25% of income earners, it's 75%. Showing very clearly there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of households in desperate need of affordable housing. As we know, Rebuilding Ireland, when it was originally published, had no targets whatsoever for affordable housing. And while now there are a number of schemes, cost rental pilots, the Service Sites Fund, LIHAF, and the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan, the targets are still very hard to understand. So maybe over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, we might get 6,000 to 10,000 affordable rental and purchase units, but clearly nowhere close to what is required. And all of that, of course, is before we even start to raise the issue of Brexit. Now, we've just had, I think, two very, very interesting hearings in the Oireachtas Housing Committee this week and last week. And what all of the people talking to us at that committee were saying, the ESRI, the Nevin Institute, the industry bodies, etc., was that any negative Brexit, whether it's a hard Brexit or a negative soft Brexit, is going to have an impact both on housing demand in terms of increased inward migration, whether from Britain or elsewhere in the European Union, but it's also going to have an impact on private sector costs in terms of construction and financing, and potentially negatively affecting delivery of the private sector units. So, on the one hand, Rebuilding Ireland and the NDP won't meet social or affordable housing need. And we have a very, very significant risk coming down the line, which could further reduce private sector supply at a time when, in fact, we have a significant reduction in the number of private rental units in the private rental sector, but could also knock some of the social housing support targets offline as private sector units that are targeted for HAP, for RAS, for long-term leasing don't come on stream. So the conclusion of all of this is that the current plan, even if one thought it was a good plan and thought it was going to deliver on all its targets, is not going to meet anything close to the level of social and affordable housing need. And it's on that basis that I've brought forward the bill in front of us today. It's very simple. It says that with respect to standard private sector developments, the Part 5 component of social affordable units should be hit at about 25%, close to the original Fianna Fáil legislation of 20%. But it also adds that in strategic development zones, particularly because of the importance of these sites, which I'll come back to in a moment, the target actually should be 30% of social and affordable, the mix to be determined by the local authority and the planning process. Now, the first thing is this, is that many developments are already doing this. In my own constituency, for example, in Shackleton, a developer recently entered into a voluntary agreement with the local authority into housing for 26% social housing. Makes eminent sense from their point of view. The Minister will know his predecessor, Simon Coveney, played a very positive role with Dublin City Council and local communities in Poolbeg to ensure that that strategic development zone would have just under 30% social and affordable housing. So actually what we're putting on the table at the minute isn't something that's not already happening. Many developers are actually very interested in a higher percentage of Part 5 because it solves some of their financing problems. It makes it easier to secure bank finance for the remainder. And what's also important about this is the government says that mixed tenure is key to sustainable communities. The problem is, in fact, many of the social housing infill projects, and I support these projects, but they're not encouraging greater mixed tenure. In fact, there's social housing in infill in areas with large volumes of social housing already in place. And there is the beginnings of some research from social housing policy experts here in this state that if you have too small a portion of Part 5, that actually creates a sense of isolation and marginalisation for the small numbers of social housing or lower income tenants living in large private housing estates. So in fact, if you were really serious about sustainable communities in terms of the mixed income, mixed tenure model, you would be looking to have a larger portion of Part 5 in private developments beyond the 10% that is currently in place. So both from the point of view of the developers, from the point of view of need and from the point of view of the government's own policy, what is in this bill is actually eminently sensible and something I would find hard that anybody would be unable to support. Now, and I don't want to sound disrespectful, but I can almost hear the Minister's speech as I'm saying those words. I'm sure the Minister is going to tell us that he appreciates the sentiment behind the bill, that he accepts that I'm being genuine in trying to increase the supply of social and affordable housing. But he's going to tell us about unintended consequences. And it's become almost a kind of the standard response of government when something is actually a good proposal, but for whatever reason they don't want to support it and they rely on the politics of unintended consequences. And the irony is, the only unintended consequence that I can imagine the government might say in this is they might allege that the developer denied the profit margin on the 15% of what would have been private and would now be social or affordable, seeks to recoup that profit on the remainder of the private units. The irony, of course, is every time we propose putting social housing into a private development, what's the first thing everybody tells us? That's going to lower the value of the private sector homes. It's one of the objections some councillors from some parties around the country actually try and block Part 5 developments. So, in fact, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest, and if the Minister does use that argument, I hope he relies on evidence rather than just supposition to justify his position. With respect to Fianna Fáil, and I'm genuine, I don't know what the party's position would be. So suppose what I'd say to you is this. I would really hope that you would support the bill, both in terms of its spirit and the fact that it's closer to your own original bill. But if, by chance, for example, you're concerned that 25% is too high, I'm open to amendment at committee stage. Genuinely. I would prefer 25, I think there's a good logic to it. But for example, if at committee stage Fianna Fáil wanted to genuinely say, we think a lower percentage is something we could agree, I'm open to doing that. Because anything above 10% is better than the 10%. And likewise with the 30% on the SDZ, and I appreciate it's a slightly different idea, but if Fianna Fáil were interested, again in a genuine discussion with us, either on the percentage or on the wording in terms of how we frame that, so it could be an aspiration of up to 30% rather than a minimum, we are genuinely open to doing that. And the reason why I say that is because something very important happened in the Housing Committee today. A very positive outcome of strong collaboration between opposition parties, spurred on, I have to say, by the very successful mobilisation of students in Dublin and Galway and elsewhere, put an issue on the agenda of this House that I don't think the government was intending to deal with. Opposition parties, and in particular ourselves in Fianna Fáil, but others supportive too, said we need action on this. And we tabled our own legislation. We met with the Minister. To the Minister's credit, the Minister accepted the arguments that we put forward, and it was reported to the Housing Committee today that the Department are working on amendments in line with the intent of both the Sinn Féin bill, the Fianna Fáil bill and the desire of other political parties in the committee. And it looks like we're going to end up with exactly the kinds of protections that everybody here says they want as a result of that action. So I suppose my appeal to Fianna Fáil today is we did it in student housing. I think there's a credible argument that we could do it on this as well, and we are genuinely open to compromise if that is of any way of assistance. The last thing I'll say is this: what's the consequence of us not doing this? Well, the consequence of us not doing this is very simple. There will be less social and affordable houses. And at a time when, no matter what interpretation of the figures you give, we are in desperate need of increased output, then I think anything which increases the quantum of social and affordable housing is something that has to be measured. And the offer I made to Fianna Fáil of looking at the percentages and the wording, I also make to government. We said today, as we progressed our own student accommodation bill, that if the government brings forward their own amendments, we'll take ours off the table. And I'm making exactly the same offer here today. If the government comes forward with something sensible and credible, we'll work on a cross-party basis to achieve it. To conclude, I want to go back to the Housing Agency's conference yesterday. I know the Minister spoke at the start, and I was there for the bulk of the presentations. One of the really interesting things that struck me was, during the course of the conference, a range of voices who were particularly expert at looking at the private rental sector made some very startling and very blunt observations. So Sherry Fitzgerald, no organisation known for left-wing radicalism and state intervention, very, very clearly stated that if you take out the properties that are leaving the private rental sector, the 9,000 rental properties we've lost in the last year and a half, and if you look at the low level of private sector investment in the private rental sector at the minute, maybe producing about 4,500, 5,000 units a year at a time we need 10,000 units, then clearly we have a huge problem in the rental sector. And Ernst & Young, another organisation not known for the radical socialist politics or strong advocacy of state intervention, said if you look at what's happening with job growth in the economy, while there's very, very positive signs in aggregate, there are large numbers of people coming into employment who are still on low or modest wages, and that the activity in the private rental sector from the private investors will not meet the need of those people now in work, in many cases not eligible for social housing support and desperately in need of affordable rental or indeed purchase. And when John O'Connor, with all of his expertise, was asked, did he think that the market could fix that problem, and was it not time for an even greater level of public intervention in the affordable housing market, particularly rental, he said yes. And he wasn't having a pop at any particular political party, but he said very clearly, in his view, he didn't believe that there was a sufficient appreciation across the political spectrum of the scale of intervention in state-led affordable housing, particularly affordable rental housing, to tackle the crisis, and that if we didn't address that, we were going to end up with an even bigger problem in the months ahead. So to conclude, Ceann Comhairle, this is a genuine attempt to put a proposition on the table to deal with an important issue. It's not going to solve all of the problems, but I think it's a small but significant piece of the jigsaw to advance the responses to the crisis. And I'm genuinely urging all parties and independents to look at it positively, to support the intention of the bill, and if they want to amend it, we're open to amending it at committee stage to ensure that instead of the 10% that's currently been provided, we can have potentially 15, 20, or I'd much prefer 25%, to ensure a greater level of social and affordable housing is delivered in the years ahead for the people who so desperately need it. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.